I believe I have just cracked the code on being able to make the simplest thin cutting jig that there is out there. And I want to show you exactly how I made this scrap wood jig to be able to be very effective and very accurate. So how does this work? Well, it only has one moving part. You set the thickness of the thin strip that you want, lock it down, and then run the strip through. You do not have to reset anything at all. You can just take and cut 1, 2, 3, however many strips that you need without resetting up the whole operation. And as far as thickness, this is 1.68 millimeters. If you want it thinner, well, you can do that too. And of course, if you want a little bit thicker, you can do that as well. All with one easy step. Cutting thin strips is a big challenge, and over the years I have created all types of different jigs to be able to cut the thin strips, and with limited results. They were oftentimes too cumbersome and, quite frankly, a little bit dangerous to be able to use. Well, with this jig that I designed today, it is safe, it's easy to use, and it has only one moving part on it. I have a piece of scrap 1/2 inch plywood. Now typically when I make jigs, I use it out of 3/4 material, and oftentimes it's MDF, which is medium density fiberboard. Now for this test, I'm just going to go ahead and use the 1/2 inch plywood because that's what I have available. Now there's no plans for this. This is something that I just thought about in my head, and I decided to basically make it up as we go along with just a simple idea in my head to be able to make this thin strip cutting jig work. Now as far as the length of this material, I just cut it the same length as the table saw itself. Could it be a little bit longer, a little bit shorter? I don't know. It's just a measurement that I decided to take and use. As far as the width of this, it's roughly 12 inches, 12.5 inches. Again, this is just scrap wood. I didn't even measure to see exactly what it was. So this is going to be the base for my simple jig. So roughly 28 by, let's just say 12 inches. Next I took the square and I measured over 5 inches from the edge. And this again is just an arbitrary number. It could possibly be a little bit smaller, but I'm going to start out with the 5 inches, and I'm going to put a pencil line all the way down the full length of this material. Next I'm taking another small piece of scrap wood, and I'm just going to put it right at the end of my base and then slide it over next to the saw blade. I want to be able to have this piece basically be a long taper that will actually separate the thin strip of material that I cut from the blade itself. And again, no tape measure. This is just an eyeball guess as to how flexible the wood is going to be and when it needs to be separated from the blade. Next, I'm going to take another piece of the scrap wood, and you can see it's not even a straight square. It's got a rough side on it, but I'm taking the T-square from that bottom point that I had just marked and create a long taper. And then from there, I'll use the tapering jig and be able to cut that off. Now off camera, I use the tapering jig to cut this strip of wood with this long point on it, and that's going to be the critical part of this jig. Now to be able to make this go together quickly, I'm just using a few drops of the Starbond medium CA glue, and I'm going to put that right down on this line that I have drawn on this base. If this jig works as I think it will, I'm going to come back and I'll add some screws and just make it a little bit more stable and secure. And if this jig doesn't work, well, I'll just have to repurpose this wood and come up with a different idea. I moved the table saw fence over to the 5 inches. Remember, that's the measurement that I use for that line. And I'm going to run this through the table saw just past where this long point is. Okay, before I make that cut, I realized I don't have a way to clamp this base to the table saw. So it was back to the scrap bin and to find a piece of wood that's going to work. Again, no tape measure. I'm just going to cut this waste material off so it's a nice, clean, straight edge. So I'll lock the fence down and I'll run this strip through the table saw and just clean it up. As far as the size, of course, it's 28 inches long. The width is roughly 1.5 inches. Really don't know, but it's going to be wide enough to be able to have a clamp to hold this base. I'm just going to use some white glue along with the CA glue to be able to put this together quickly and to be able to test it out. So the white glue will hold it for the long term, but to be able to temporarily put it together, I'm just using a few drops of glue in between the white glue that I put down. So yes, I did leave some little space to be able to put that CA glue in. And then I don't have to wait for glue to dry. I can just literally put it together and keep moving. A little bit of accelerator on this long strip, and then literally just push it together. The CA glue is going to do its job to be able to act as a clamp, and the white glue will dry over time and be able to hold it nice and strong. So this will give a secure joint. Again, later on, if this jig is successful, I'm sure I'm going to come back and I'll add a few nails just to be able to give it a little bit of extra strength. So at this point, I have the strip on, and that's where I can clamp this to the fence itself and be able to hold this jig securely on the table saw. Okay, it's time to move the fence over now, and I can set this up roughly 5.5 inches, but I'm going to cut right on that line that I had drawn earlier. Remember, that line was drawn at 5 inches. We've added roughly a 1/2 inch material, so we'll be cutting this right on that line, approximately 5.5 inches. When I cut this line, I'm actually cutting this through the base, and I'm also cleaning up the edge of that long tapered strip that I put on. That way it's a nice straight edge, perfectly aligned with the saw blade itself. That taper is going to go to roughly almost the center of the blade. And this is going to be a little bit of a test to see exactly where it needs to be. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and clamp this down so that the base is secured to the table saw. Now I'm just going to use one clamp right now. I may have to come back and add a second clamp at the other end of this. Don't know yet, but we're going to start out with this setup. So next I need to be able to design exactly what I want the adjustable fence to look like. This adjustable fence is going to have a very small amount of movement because cutting the thin strips, I'm going to go basically from virtually 1 millimeter up to maybe 5-6 millimeters tops. After that, I'll be able to just rip the strip of wood on the table saw without this jig. So the first thing, I want to mark the right side of this kerf all the way down, because that's going to be the zero line for this auxiliary fence. I switched over to a longer straight edge to be able to continue that line all the way down. Now remember, this is my 0 point. If I put the auxiliary fence right on this line, it will cut nothing at all. Next, I need a piece of scrap wood again to be able to use the movable fence. Now this fence needs to be as long as possible, but I do need to have that opening so that that thin strip can slide to the right of the saw blade. Okay, now that I have this cut, I need to be able to set up where I'm going to put the bolts to be able to tighten this down. And I think I'm going to use 2 of them, and I'm going to use them fairly close to the ends of this board. So again, I'm just doing some rough measurements, and let's just say this is roughly about 1.5 inches from the end of the board. And of course, I'm going to put that hole right into the center. And yes, I'm doing this on both ends. Now I'm going to make this where it is a slot, and it will slide back and forth. I only need it to move roughly about 1/2 inch all total. I need this right in the center, so I'm just using this angle method with the ruler to be able to set up to find the center. And that's a lot easier than trying to measure the actual width of the board and establish the center. Using this diagonal method with the ruler gives you the perfect measurement every time. There are several different methods that I had thought about being able to set this up so that this will move. But I think in the end, I'm just going to set this up where I cut a 1/4 inch hole, and I'll make this as a slot. And that way this fence will be able to slide back and forth, and the bolts will actually just screw into a T-nut in the bottom of this base. So next I need to mark on this base itself exactly where I need that hole. Now I'll mark it and I'll pre-drill on this side to be able to get the location. And then we'll just flip it over and we'll drill and put in the T-nuts. If I try to be able to do all this work from the bottom, I really would have no idea where that hole actually needs to be. This way I have the exact location on the front side, and by drilling a pilot hole first, I'll know exactly where I need to drill on the bottom. Now, one thing I want to point out, this is a very small little pilot hole that I'm drilling here. Basically, all this is doing is marking the location on the bottom of this base. Now, I'm using a Forstner bit, and I believe this is a 1/2 inch. The bottom line is, this is the same diameter as the widest portion of the T-nut itself. And this only needs to be drilled very shallow, just basically the thickness of that bottom plate on the T-nut. Then I'll take the T-nut itself and just test the depth of that hole. And this is going to work out perfect. Next, I'm switching over to a 5/16 inch drill bit, and I'll drill through the rest of this hole. And that is the diameter of the outside portion of the T-nut itself. And I'm trying to do this where I could drill from both sides just to avoid some of the tear out, and that actually worked out pretty well. There's a little bit of tear out, but that's okay. I'm using the Starbond 5-minute epoxy to be able to secure these T-nuts into those holes. Now, I'm just using a popsicle stick with a little piece of aluminum foil to put the equal parts of the epoxy on here, and then I just basically cover the bottom of that hole really well. I want to be able to have good coverage because I really don't want that T-nut to break loose. Not that there's going to be a lot of pressure on it, but I just really don't want to take a chance. And using this 5-minute epoxy will do the job. Now, I'm using a 1/4 T-nut for this project. And now I can just flip this over and shove it in. I'll just temporarily put both of these in. Then I'm going to take a hammer and just tap them in place. And yes, I'm moving this over to the workbench. I'm not going to hammer these T-nuts in on the table saw. That is not the way to do it. But I want to hammer these in and get them flush with the bottom, wipe off any excess glue, and that part will be done. I did take a straight edge just to make sure that they were completely flush and below the surface of this so that it would not cause a problem when it was on the table saw itself. While the glue is drying on the T-nuts, I'm going to go over to the router table and set up and drill these slots into my fence. Now again, I'm not using a tape measure. This is all just eyeballing to be able to get this where I want it. I'm using a 1/4 inch spiral bit that I use typically on the CNC machine, and this will work perfect for this application. The 2 pieces of plywood here are going to be the stops. The only reference that I'm using is the pencil line that I drew on this little fence itself. So the fence on the router table gives me my depth, and those 2 pieces of plywood will be the length of the slot. So with all of this set up now, it's time to be able to cut it out. Now I'm going to do this in one pass, so I have the bit raised up high enough to accomplish that. Then I can just move it over just a little bit to create that slot, and I'll move it back and do that a couple times to make sure that that slot is completely clear, and that looks absolutely perfect. Then I'll flip it over and do the other side. So this is one simple setup to be able to do the slots on both ends of this little movable fence. And it doesn't need to be long because, again, we're working with thin strips that we want to be able to cut, and we don't need to have those slots very big at all. Now these knobs that I'm using are from another project, and it worked out really well to have the 1/4 knobs. If I didn't have any, yes, I would have made my own. Hey, there we go. Perfect fit the first time. I didn't need to make any additional adjustments. Well, the time has come now to see if this very simple jig is actually going to work. So I'm just going to slide it into the table saw right to this location. I'll take the clamp and clamp it down. That way the jig itself will not move. From there, I'm just going to go find a scrap piece of wood that I can actually cut and see if we can make some thin strips. To be able to set up the thickness, I'll use the speed square to be able to set this fence so it's going to cut a very thin strip, and it'll maintain the fact that it's nice and square. Now if this jig works, I'll come up with a different idea later on to be able to make this process easier as well. I found a piece of 3/4 inch pine that I think is going to be real good for a test piece. Now, being that this is pine, it may not bend as easily as I hope, but that's the whole idea of this kind of a test. So as I run this through the saw blade, you can see that thin strip basically just peeling off. That's what I wanted. That way it's safe, your hands are out of the way, you make one adjustment and you can make as many of these thin strips as you wish. Okay, there you go. Look at this. You have a consistent thickness all the way down. That looks really good. Let me get the calipers and let's measure this and see exactly the thickness that we have. Now this is set in millimeters, so we're looking at about 2.1 millimeters thick. And that consistently is the same all the way down. That looks real good. I am very, very pleased with how this turned out. The problem with most thin strip jigs is that you have to make the adjustment each time. This one you don't. So now, without doing anything at all, let's make another cut and cut another thin strip using the exact same setup. Another problem with most jigs out there is that the thin strip is hard to be able to capture, or it's going to get caught between the blade and the fence. Well, that is not the case with this jig. This strip is completely free to be able to move away from the blade and is not even close to the fence. So there's no chance that this strip can get caught and be thrown back at you. Likewise, the large piece that we're making these cuts from cannot get in a position where it gets jammed into the saw blade and have a kickback. Next, I'm going to adjust the fence and we're going to cut a thin strip even thinner. That's right, we're going to make it less than this 2 millimeters thick. Now again, at this point, I'm not trying to be precise with my measurement. If I want to actually measure and get a precise thickness, I could actually measure from the blade itself or from that pencil line over to the fence. Right now, I'm just doing a little experimenting to see if I can cut it less than the 2 millimeters. And this looks real good so far. So once this is finished, we'll take the calipers and we'll measure it. Okay, let's take a look and see what we have. Looks like 1.6 millimeters. And we can slide down and we can measure this at another location and let's see what we get. And this one looks like about 1.68. Again, real consistent on the thickness. So this, I think, is a total success. So here you go. This is by far the simplest jig that I think I have ever made to be able to cut the thin strips. And I think that this one is, quite frankly, the best one that I've ever done. So if you need to cut some thin strips in your shop, I hope you take a look and build one like this. Well, there you go. This thin strip jig worked far better than I had actually hoped for. And these thin strips are going to be perfect. Now you can do all kinds of different projects using the thin strips. And this is what I have wanted to do for a long time. And I'm glad that I was able to share this with you. And if you need to make thin strips in your shop, I hope that you'll take an opportunity to consider making a simple jig such as this. I think it's going to be a lot better than all the different jigs that I have seen out there on the YouTube. Now, if you like this video, by all means, give me a thumbs up and don't forget, subscribe right down there below. If you want to take a look at some more jigs and different projects that I've done in the shop, take a look at this videos right up there. And for now, I look forward to seeing you in the next video that I'll be doing real soon. So for now, bye-bye, everyone.